What is up, fellow book and movie-ers? It's me, the book and movie guy, here with another book and movie guy video, as I do. Today I'm going to be talking about the Stephen King novel, The Drawing of the Three. This is the second of the 8 Dark Tower novels, and in this series I kind of talk about one trait of each novel that I think is truly great or represents the best part of the series and or Stephen King's writing. Okay, so as I said, The Drawing of the Three is the second in the Dark Tower series. It is a direct sequel to The Gunslinger and is the precursor to The Wastelands and all the other books after that. So in prepping for this video, I thought about exploring a couple different options for what I thought was great about this book. I considered pacing, world building, character development, but really couldn't just pin down one that I felt stood out in this book in a way that didn't stand out in the other books in the series. So what I ultimately decided to do was just roll all that together in like a sandwich. Sandwiches aren't rolls. And like a wrap, and focus on the fact that this book really at the end of the day is just a perfect sequel. So fundamentally, the first thing that a good sequel needs to do is retain what makes the original great or good, but expand on it in some way that feels different and refreshing without alienating fans of the previous work. An example of that can be seen right in the opening passage of this book. So the book opens up with Roland stuck on a beach after his quest in the first novel, and immediately he meets his most powerful foe yet, the Lobstrosities. Now, first of all, I just want to say that I think the Lobstrosities are some of Stephen King's best literal monsters. They're a fun villain and they're also creepy, and there's something that I never forgot after reading these books the first time, the Dada Chum, Dada Chick, and the way they just so quickly and ruthlessly come along and snap off Roland's fingers sets very high stakes for this novel because, as discussed in my last video, Roland's greatest strength is that he can shoot his way out of anything. He's the strongest person in Midworld. Easy. He relies on that too much, and it's also his greatest weakness, and so in this novel he immediately loses a lot of his gunslinging ability because his fingers are bit off, as well as a couple of his toes. Once he loses his fingers, Roland can no longer shoot his way out of everything. Beyond that, he's also extremely sick. He's dying throughout the entire novel because he has an infection due to the loss of his fingers from the lobsters. What this does is force Roland to rely on other traits of himself besides just his shooting and gunslinger training. Specifically, it forces Roland to rely on other people. Roland has never been very good at relying on others. This is really seen in the fourth novel, Wizard and Glass. And a big part of his character, not just in this novel, but in the series in general, is learning to rely on others, on his quartet. In my last video, I talked about how in some ways Roland was a rebuttal of classic Western heroes, and that continues in this novel because classic Western heroes are often, again, loners. They go off by themselves, they do things alone by shooting. Roland can't do that in this book. Roland has to rely on the people around him, has to rely on a team. Of course, there are Westerns that focus on teams of people working together, like The Magnificent Seven, which is a huge influence on the fifth book in the series, The Woods of Lacala. But this is the first time Roland is really forced to rely and take account for his actions through other people. Normally he can just rely on himself. In this novel, that's not the case. He would not make it very far were it not for the divine intervention of Ka or whatever, and the need for him to rely on Eddie specifically. Not only does this change and add depth to Roland's character, but it also raises the stakes for the series, as again, something that we've previously been able to rely on to get us out of trouble is no longer present. Another thing that makes this novel great in terms of sequelitis is how much more growth Roland as a character receives. A lot of this is again due to him having to rely on Eddie and Odetta, Susanna, whatever you want to call her, and the others, but not exclusively. In this book, Roland is a lot more reflecting on his actual actions and the consequences of them, specifically from the first novel, and we see an introspective side of him that wasn't really present in The Gunslinger, despite most of that book being him just thinking about things. And this is more for him to reflect on. We're more acquainted with his character and his history, and we get more information on it as well. And we also get to see how his prior notions of the world and his own actions change once he's forced to meet and encounter new people and experiences in this novel. Because Roland has to actually interact with other human beings in this book, again, unlike in the first, we also get to see more of his comedic side. There's really no humor in The Gunslinger, particularly from Roland himself, but Eddie Dean is a very funny, outlandish character, and seeing the way, Roland, who's typically fairly stiff, has to interact with that clown, essentially, is very interesting. And we do find that Roland does have a sense of humor, despite pretending that he doesn't. His sense of humor comes through more in later books, but this is the first time we get to really see him interact in a funny way with somebody who he just really has no idea what to make of. Another thing this novel adds to Roland's character is his intelligence. It's not as if he comes across as stupid in the first book, but he never really has to think his way around anything. But in this novel, specifically at the end, when he's taking control of Jack Mort and doing all that business with the police officers and stuff, you really see how smart Roland is, both through the way that he observes other people and the world around him, but also in the way he strategically plans his way out of situations. And if he does have to use violence, in this book he really has kind of a tactical, methodical way of laying it out and going about it, whereas in the first novel he just sort of shoots his way out of everything because there's no need to really plan or think. This novel puts Roland into more corners, and you have to see the way that he's able to think his way out of them, whether that be relying on his own intuitions or other characters. It's always fun and adds a lot of depth and capability to this guy. Now, speaking of some of those new characters like Eddie, again, they force Roland to change in a lot of different ways. We get to see Roland interact with and react to things that were never even thought of in the first novel. As mentioned, Eddie is a perfect counter to Roland. He's dependent on his substance, he's very loud, he's very crass, whereas Roland is very stoic and reserved. They make a great team and a great balance, and I love the tension that exists between the two characters, including that scene where Eddie is like this close to slitting Roland's throat because he's pissed off that Roland has basically kidnapped him and pulled him into another world. Eddie also doesn't quite jive with how Roland wants to deal with the whole Detta, Susanna situation. So there's some really good tension there. I like that they aren't just buddy-buddy immediately. The horror of Eddie's situation really comes through well, and Roland's kind of stoic empathy also makes him more endearing. He seems very cold in the first book, and he's cold in this book, but there's a logical and, again, tactical reason as to why he's behaving the way he is. And in the end, Roland is shown to be much more compassionate and effective at understanding people than he is in the first novel. Eddie and Odetta also bring a ton of life to the series, and not just the series, but also Roland's setting. Again, in my previous video, I talked a lot about how desolate and empty and dead Roland's world feels. Eddie specifically adds so much life and vitality to this world and series in a way that I think totally saves Stephen King's writing. Were a character like Eddie not in this book, I think that Roland's world would get old and boring very, very early. Like, you can't have everybody be stoic and sad, so having a comedic relief character who also has a lot of depth like Eddie is really something that makes this book work. Eddie's character also adds a lot to the overarching theme of addiction and obsession in the series, and this book probably has the most information and substance about that theme out of any of the 7 or 8, and I think it's very interesting to compare Roland's obsession with the tower to Eddie's obsession with heroin, or, his addiction to heroin. I also think that Eddie and his addiction forced Roland to reconsider how he views the tower for the first time in the series. In the first book, yes, he felt bad about letting Jake go for that obsession, but in this one, he really thinks about it for the first time, and that's something that's built on in the next novel a lot when Roland starts basically dissociating and tripping balls because he's existing two versions of reality. Eddie's also a very easy character to attach to because he feels so human. He's flawed, he's screwed up, he doesn't know what's happening, he's freaking out the entire time, whereas Roland is just used to this desolate world. Eddie is a great insert or connection for readers, especially readers who might not have connected with Roland necessarily in the first novel. I think Eddie is the reason so many people like this book more than the Gunslinger, because he's significantly more relatable than the Gunslinger than Roland, which obviously is the entire point of him being there. But Stephen King chose a really good frame to hang that kind of necessary insert for the reader on, and I think he works a lot more strongly as a character than Odetta does. I'm sure there are readers that identify with more and relate more to Odetta, but I think that Eddie, because he's such a mess, is just so much more relatable for a lot of people, and that's why he's such a fan favorite. Speaking of Detta/Odetta, Detta is a great villain for a number of reasons, because it's easy to constantly want to have a villain who is all-powerful, all-knowing, omnipotent, can destroy everything in a single heartbeat, whatever. But Detta is fun because she's just like a minor obstacle for most of the book. She's a nuisance, she's annoying, she's unpleasant, and she's just there to make the heroes' lives miserable. And sometimes it is fun to have a villain who's just there to ruin everybody's day. That's not to say that Detta isn't a real threat. Like, she's tied up, she's neutralized for most of the book, but you know that if she escapes, Eddie and Roland are in trouble. And it's just another example of how Stephen King places obstacles in every part of this book to make it difficult for Roland and Eddie to be successful. This book definitely feels kind of like a game of chess, which is an important metaphor throughout the series, especially in the 4th book. But this is great because they can't just leave the beach to go into the real world and do whatever, because that'd be an easy fix to all the problems. They can't just kill her, they can't just shoot their way out of this thing. Roland knows they need her, and they have to put in the real work, both as people and as characters, to understand Odetta/Detta and figure out what is going to give her that important balance that they are seeking, not only in the novel, like thematically, but also as characters and for her as a character. And really, Odetta/Detta is a great metaphor for the entire series, especially if you're looking at it through the lens of addiction. Yes, you have to balance your needs and wants with your responsibilities and the things that you owe other people. You can't just blaze your way through every situation to get what you want. You have to put in very important personal work, both for yourself and for the people around you, in order to strike a significant and healthy balance between the thing you are trying to get and appreciating the things that you already have. So in short, I think Detta's a good villain because sometimes a petty, just nuisance villain can be just as dangerous as the most powerful villain. For instance, think of Bulk and Skull from the Power Rangers. You know, a couple years ago, I guess it's been more than a couple, that super edgy, serious, like fan-made Power Rangers film came out, and some people really loved it and some people really hated it. Something I always liked about that is the brief cameo that Bulk and Skull have.
Got a little tired of being made fun of by you cunty fucks.
Skull, you sold us out!
Stephen King has always been great at making his incompetent stooges dangerous. For instance, Lloyd from The Stand. He's a guy who's pretty harmless by himself, but when you put him with somebody slightly smarter or more ambitious, he becomes very dangerous because he's an enabler. He's a stepping stone to destruction. Detta is more dangerous than that, but she's a similar character to like a Bulk and Skull or a Lloyd. By herself, she's not really all that threatening, especially if you can neutralize her, but if she's free and has nobody to stand in her way, she's a very dangerous enemy, and I like that. She's also a really good counter to a significantly more dangerous enemy, who is Jack Mort. Because Detta just does things to upset and bother people, Jack Mort is actually like an evil son of a bitch. He hurts and kills people just because he can, and again, he fits really well into that theme of chaos and balance that's present throughout the rest of the novel and the series. Jack Mort as a villain is also a great representation of what Roland can fix by reaching his tower. In the first book and throughout most of this book, I don't think it's really clear what's at stake if Roland doesn't meet his goal, even though they talk about it several times. Jack Mort is the first time that we as the reader, and I also think the characters like Eddie and even Roland, can see what the collapse of the tower results in. Because Jack Mort is just this senseless agent of death and chaos, we're able to understand that, oh, that's what the tower is keeping away. The tower is about balance, so that there's always somebody like Roland there to stop guys like Jack Mort. We get to see how Jack Mort ruins lives, how he hurts people like Odetta and Jake, and we recognize that, yeah, that's a bad thing you don't want happening. Basically, it makes it easy to root for Roland, whereas in the first book, I think it's pretty unclear as to why you should want to root for this guy or be on his side. While I'm talking about the characters, I should note that I think the weakest part of this novel is the romance. I think that Eddie and Odetta's relationship is kind of fast, and I understand that yes, they're the only two like-minded people essentially in the universe. They're both young, especially Eddie. Eddie's just coming off a very turbulent time with addiction. It makes sense that he would latch onto her. I'm not as sold on her latching onto him. I do think their relationship is fixed in later novels, especially the one right after this, The Wastelands, but in this novel, I think it's pretty shallow. They really only have one moment that I think is tender or sweet. The rest is just kind of odd. So that's, I think, probably my biggest issue with the characters in this book. It's not like it damages the book. I just think King could have put a little bit more time and work into it. But I understand why he didn't, because this novel just flies along at such a wonderful pace, and there's so much going on. It's hard to take the time to develop that relationship, especially when most of Odetta's time on the page is spent as Detta Walker, whose entire purpose in existence is hating Eddie. So I understand why it's not there, but I do think this novel suffers somewhat from lack of development in that relationship. Okay, another thing about this novel that makes it a perfect sequel is the change of setting. Changing your setting can be very disastrous if you don't do it well, but this novel does it effectively because it blends the settings of the previous novel very well with a setting we're used to, which is the real world. There is a little bit of that in The Gunslinger, but this novel really expands on it, with about probably 2/3 of it being set in New York and then about 1/3 of it being set in Midworld, and all of that like on a very scraggly run of beach. I remember the first time I read this book, I didn't like the sections in New York because I thought, why would you create such a cool world and setting in Midworld just to abandon it for the boring old real world? I was wrong as a child. I definitely enjoy, still as an adult, reading those Midworld sections more, but the balance between the two, I think, is really effective and again helps the pacing of this novel, and also helps keep things fresh and interesting, because again, Roland and the story and his skills and the characters or whatever all have to adapt to this new setting and change in a way that is interesting and fun to read about. Another thing that these settings do very well is accentuate each other through contrast, which was sort of saying nothing, but what I talked about extensively in my Gunslinger video is the atmosphere of Roland's world having moved on. And the Gunslinger characterizes moving on as mostly being desolate, empty, broken, run down, and terrible. Now, when Roland goes to New York, he's fascinated by how, like, civilized and bustling and populated everything is. You know, he talks about being amazed by the skyscrapers, amazed by all the different types of food we have, the glass, the books, all these resources. Roland is blown away by the abundance of our world, and yet our world is still full of misery. Specifically, if you look at the Dean brothers, Eddie and his older brother Henry. There's a long section of Eddie thinking about what a terrible person Henry really was. And specifically, there's a scene that recounts how Henry became a heroin addict in the first place. He was shipped off to Vietnam and he came back with like a leg or a knee injury, I think, and he was subscribed with painkillers. And eventually his prescription for painkillers was taken away. So he started self-medicating, and eventually that led him to heroin. That's a perfect example of our world moving on or turning its back on people in need of help. Henry Dean is someone who went and fought for his country and risked everything, and when he returned home, his country basically gave him nothing. He and Eddie live in the populated, robust, technologically advanced New York City, but as children, they have no access to resources, they don't have any opportunities, they don't have stable parents at home, they spend all their time out on the streets, you know, getting beat up, stealing, getting into fights, getting into trouble, and using drugs. I love the way Stephen King counters this type of setting with Roland's. Even in a world where you have the ability to help and do everything for everyone, there are still people like the Dean brothers getting left behind. The world is moving on and intentionally forgetting about the people who aren't willing to move on with it, or specifically aren't able to move on with it. This also applies really well to Odetta/Detta in the 1960s. Whether you want to view it through the perspective of Americans with disabilities, or African Americans, or any other kind of civil rights, Odetta and Detta are characters who have been left behind by a world that is moving on. Of course, Odetta is trying very hard to move on with it. She's trying to be an advocate for civil rights and go out there and do what she believes in, yet the world pushes back at her at every possible turn, trying desperately to leave her behind. Again, we see this specifically through the character Jack Mort, who pushes her in front of a train, chops off her legs, or drops a brick on her head when she's a child, creating the character of Detta, who of course stands in the way of progress and desperately fights against the world, trying to leave her behind, not by making it better, but by making it worse so that everyone around her is as miserable as she is. There's a lot of really great, effective, and interesting subtextual content here about addiction and society needing to do more to help people who are addicted or people who are oppressed and marginalized and whatever. And there's a great commentary by Stephen King here about society and worlds in general, and what causes societies really to collapse, fall apart, and decay. There's also a lot of great calling out of excess and capitalism and consumerism, while we neglect the things of actual substance that matter, which is addiction and equal rights and opportunities for everyone, and also just basic compassion and real human connection. All of Eddie's relationships prior to meeting Roland and Susanna are fake. They're predicated on either familial/blood ties like with Henry, or on a dependency through shared substance abuse and addiction. The people he's closest to, like Balazar, are all terrible, they're awful, they're mean, and he only connects with others because he wants to get his next fix. In this novel, Stephen King kills off Henry pretty quickly, and though it's obviously a huge blow for Eddie, it's something that allows Eddie to move forward from his addiction and surround himself with positive and loving people. Obviously, like I mentioned in my last video, Stephen King struggled with addiction a lot, but he's also a huge family man. And I think this is actually one of his best novels about family, despite it not having something that's even remotely close to a traditional family on display, whereas a lot of his other books like The Shining or The Dark Half or whatever actually focus on intricate blood-related families with marriages and children, whatever. This book is about the power of family and friendship. And all that comes through because of the setting. So I think that's a perfect example of how setting can add to your theme and relationships, which is something I discussed in my last video, but it's here too. The last thing this book does well is create a great setup for the next installment in the series. It's a pretty decent self-contained story, like it feels complete, doesn't feel like it's gimmicky, but at the end of this book I was definitely like, wow, I can't wait to jump back into the Wastelands. And that's what I did. I closed this book, set it down, and then reached over beside me and picked up the third book and started reading, and they just flow together seamlessly. This is not my favorite book in the series, but I think it's one of the most well written, especially from a pacing and character standpoint. The next book in the series is probably my favorite, or the fourth one. As of now, that could change as I continue to reread them, but this book definitely has a lot going on, and it is, in short, a perfect sequel. There's a lot more I could say about this one, but this video is already too long, and you're bored, and I need to move on and record another video, and my camera's gonna die. Lots of things stopping me from talking more. You're welcome. So thank you for watching. Hope you liked this video. Let me know what you thought of the drawing of the three in the comments, and I will see you next time maybe. And if not, that's cool. Peace out.